It's always an honor to be here. This is Forward 4, my fourth Forward, so I've been here for all of them, and it's been really fantastic. A couple of quick things. You'll notice what's going on here on the screen. You see 0 out of 350. That is 0 out of 350 slides, so we are going to be here for about 2.5 hours or so. Hopefully that's not a problem. Now, but what is this that I'm giving you? What is this presentation? And the best way for me to describe what this is we're going to discover this presentation as we go, because there are no slides yet. And I'm going to make the slides as we go, so we'll all see how this plays out. Before I get into the talk, I do want to talk about privilege awareness. And some of you have probably heard this at the beginning of conference talks that I've done before. I want to talk about, and very briefly, this problem in our industry that we do not have enough progress on the topic of inclusion. You notice I'm not saying diversity, because actually I don't think we should be striving for diversity. I think we should be striving for empathetic inclusion, and diversity falls out as a natural consequence of striving for empathetic inclusion. And I don't have any solutions to those problems. It's, I think, self-evident when you look around the industry that these exist, but I don't have a solution to them. But what I can say is that silence is not a solution. So I'm simply trying, whenever I'm given an opportunity to speak, to keep the conversation going. What I'm going to do very quickly is tell you some of my privilege. This is purely introspective on myself. It is not meant to say that if you look like me, you have the same privilege. Your privilege is your individual experience. But I do think that one of the ways that we can develop more empathy for those around us is to take stock regularly of our own privileges, the things that got us to the places that we are, where the person sitting to the left or the right of us maybe didn't have to work so hard to get to that same part, or maybe they had to work a lot harder to get to that same part. So I think it's important for us to be aware of those things. So I just want to briefly declare for you a couple of things that are probably self-evident, but there are things that I consider to be my own privilege. I've never had anybody question me because of my skin color, question whether or not I was competent. I've never had anybody question whether or not I did something, whether I knew what I was doing because of the gender that I was born with. And that is a fortunate thing, a privilege that not everybody has had that same privilege. I have never been in a family that couldn't afford to send me to school. One of the privileges that I grew up in is that I was going to get to go to college, and that was an assumed thing, and not everybody has that same thing. Thankfully, this is becoming less and less of a privilege, but I grew up in an area of the country where this wasn't an issue. I didn't have to be second-guessed because of my sexual orientation, for example. So these are all things that I consider to be my own privileges, and again, this is just simply to introspect upon the things that are true about myself, and to challenge you to do that as well. I think if we can introspect and we can challenge ourselves to talk more about this, maybe we can start moving towards a better solution. I want us to be more aware of the privilege that is holding some people back, or not giving some people the opportunities in this industry that they ought to have. So with that, let me jump into this talk. My name is Kyle Simpson. I'm known as Getify online, so if you have any thoughts or feedback about what I'm about to share with you tonight, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to have that feedback, even if the feedback is you're completely wrong, because I probably am. So go ahead and tell me that. I'd love for you to reach out. A couple of quick things about myself. I've written a series of books. Some of you may have heard of them. They're called You Don't Know JS. The entire 6-book, 1,100-page series is complete. It's all out in the open for free on a GitHub repo. This URL will redirect to that. They've also been published through O'Reilly, and you can purchase them. So the first edition is complete, and I should be working on the second edition later this spring. I'm also the head of curriculum for MakerSquare, which you heard from them earlier. They are a sponsor of today's conference, Software and Engineer Developer Training School, a boot camp, if you will. If you have any questions about that or have any feedback or things, I'd love for you to come and chat. So come find me and let's talk about MakerSquare. And this talk is called The Economy of Keystrokes. And it's deliberately a little bit unclear exactly what I'm talking about. I deliberately left it a little bit vague. But we're going to, as I said, we're going to unfold this talk together. So to set this up, I wanted to actually start with a somewhat famous quote from Shakespeare. This is all the world's a stage, and all the men and women are merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. And this is true on multiple levels. There's like a meta message here as a speaker up on a stage and thinking about the ephemerality of what I do for a living, what is to talk to people or to help people. And it's here for a moment, and then it's gone. But there's something deeper than that sort of question, and that's what I want us to focus on tonight. So I'm going to reformat what you're looking at here. So now what I've done is I've taken away most of the non-critical vowels and the punctuation. And human psychology tells us that virtually all people are still going to be able to get pretty good understanding of what this statement is saying. You can still get a pretty good picture of the quote from Shakespeare here, even though I've removed some of those vowels and the punctuation. So one perspective on this might be that the characters and punctuation that I have now removed were simply unnecessary. They were unnecessary noise. They were getting in the way. It was less efficient for Shakespeare to write that down and have to add all those extra vowels and punctuation in. So maybe it would have been more efficient for him had we chosen this as the means of communication. You can probably guess where I'm going with that. The question really is, even though we can understand what this is saying, is this the most effective form of communication for Shakespeare's quote? And I'm going to suggest through this talk that probably not. All right, so what we're going to do, I'm going to briefly set out a couple of metaphors for you, metaphors in the space of the economy. And I'm not an economist, so there's probably someone in this room that knows this stuff a lot better than me. Please come up and tell me how I completely butcher these ideas. But I just want to talk about metaphorically the economy and some of the components that go into finance and economy, and those will be things that I build on through the rest of the talk. So very briefly, the first most important thing when you start talking about an economy might be, for example, the currency that is traded in that economy. And I like the fact that I can shorten it, and we all still pretty much get the sense of what we're talking about here. We're talking about currency. Or maybe another way to say it is to talk about money. The money is the thing that we trade in this economy, and we trade the money that we've earned for something that we want, whether that's a new iPad or it's some food at the store. We trade that money for something that we want, and that's the grease that keeps the gears of the economy running. You always hear politicians say, well, the solution to our economic problems is we got to get people more money and have them spend more money, spend more to keep the economy going. So we have money, we have currency. We also know that the primary thing that we do in an economy is that we buy and we sell. We're buying things and we're selling things. So that's kind of the basic principle of keeping an economy going. Both those actions have to be balanced, and they both have to be happening at an active rate for the economy to keep going. In addition to buying and selling, we also have saving and investing. Now, there's an interesting extra angle here. Saving and investing. Well, saving, I want to hold on to my money, keep it in my bank account. Investing, I want to take my money and put it in somebody else's bank account, hoping that I will make some amount of interest on that, or maybe I'm kind of hedging a bet or some risk in the stock market to get some more money back based upon the actions of someone else. So there's this idea, not just of buying and selling and whether or not I keep some money because I don't actually need to buy that third iPad that I've bought this month, but then there's saving and investing and choosing wisely to do something with my money, to save it or to invest it. Those are all notions that we have to kind of juggle to participate in this overall economy. Another set of concepts in the economy are inflation and deflation, which changes the value of the actual thing I'm holding on to. So over time, I might be holding on to that same dollar, but that dollar changes in value as inflation and deflation pass through. And lastly, metaphorically, we have, I guess I'm kind of running out of characters here, so I wonder what's going to happen when I run out of, I've run out of characters in my budget. I can't spend any more characters. Actually, I can just cheat like we all can and change this to something like 1,200 characters. Okay. So, but we have budgets, and budgets are a way for us to restrain ourselves when we are spending too much, or we feel like we need to hold on to more of our money. We set up a set of budgets that constrain what we're spending. So these are the basic metaphors that I will sort of build upon as we turn our attention not to things like economics, but as we turn our attention more to the notion of keystrokes. So what I want to talk about here is the idea that we are trading keystrokes for something. And that something, the most obvious thing that we're trading our keystrokes for, is for functionality. We might say, I am trading this particular keystroke, I am adding this keystroke to my program because it buys me some feature. That's the most obvious thing that we're getting out of the keystrokes that we spend in our programs. But there's something deeper than functionality, and I think this is what most people will probably resonate with, is this notion of readability. We think that we are spending a keystroke, or rather saving a keystroke, to create more readability. And you've heard a lot of this lately. You've even heard a lot of it at the conference today. This notion that if I have a shorter form to express my code, if I save some keystrokes, for example, the arrow function. If I save some keystrokes with the arrow function, I've clearly and obviously made my code more readable. So, as an example of that sort of thing, as an example of the functions, we can write a function long form, or we can write a function now using this new syntax, the arrow. And the arrow syntax, of course, is a way to reduce, we don't need to put the function keyword there, and if you're in a particular case, you won't need a return statement, so we're saving keystrokes there. And I think it's taken almost universally that that's an improvement in readability, but I don't necessarily agree that it's actually an improvement in readability. I want to call into question whether or not that is entirely true. When we think about something like an arrow function, it's almost always referenced in one of these very happy path cases, a single line arrow function, where the proportion of characters that we saved is high. We've taken out the word function and the word return and saved 15 or 20 characters compared to the overall length of the function. Relatively speaking, we've saved quite a bit. But readability is not an objective thing, or at least not in the way that it's often cited. It turns out that readability is something that can be studied, and I did some research about this a while back. I was trying to figure out whether or not there was any well-known or established research on the topic of readability, because I hear these claims all the time, this is more readable than that, and this is more readable than that, and then I feel like something's broken with me, because somebody will tell me this code is more readable, and to me it's less readable. So is there something wrong with me? Am I lacking some understanding? So it turns out that this has been studied. This notion of code readability has been studied formally in academic studies. And I found it fascinating as I was reading through, because they claimed at the beginning of this paper that there was an objective measure that could be automated. They could literally run a tool against a piece of code and come up with an objective metric, an automated metric for knowing how quote-unquote readable that was. And I thought that was a silly notion to consider automated readability. I mean, obviously a person could sort of gauge that through talking to various people, but how could you automate some metric on something that seems and feels so clearly subjective? Well, it turns out in their study that what they found was that when they showed a piece of code to a developer, if that code was using a set of idioms or patterns that the developer had already seen and was well experienced with, the developer would immediately recognize those things and therefore rate that code as more readable. But if they showed the exact same code to someone who had not seen that set of code patterns before, not that they didn't understand the language, they understood the syntax, but there was an additional set of idioms or patterns that they were not familiar with. And they showed it to them, and universally, those pieces of code were rated less readable. So it turns out that familiarity is actually a really strong component to this notion of readability, at least when it's studied from an academic perspective. So we can throw around the word, like my code is more readable, but actually it's more readable because it might be more familiar. And familiarity leads me to this idea that I want to talk about briefly. As a person that teaches JavaScript for a living, this is near and dear to my heart, because I see developers oftentimes very early in their career, and I'm trying to help them get up to speed as quickly as possible and get out and have great jobs and be very effective in our industry. And I see them struggle with this question of what is this code that I'm looking at? If they haven't seen it before, the code can be very confusing. There's an idea called cognitive load theory, which is if I throw too much at you, too much new stuff at you, your brain fills up, and then it just starts to flow out. And stuff that you even had before, you just completely lose. So I am keenly aware of this idea that I can't throw too much at you. So the great news is if a developer already has this understanding of a particular idiom or a particular syntax or particular approach, that doesn't count against the cognitive load. It comes for free. It's this notion that we have tribal knowledge as developers. We have this special set of knowledge that we know, and it makes us effective because we know it, and anybody else that's like us and knows it can quickly and efficiently read and understand and modify our code. But someone without that tribal knowledge often struggles significantly to understand that code because they have to first get up to speed on all the tribal knowledge. And we have huge volumes of books dedicated to teaching you the tribal knowledge that you need to be part of our special group that's called a developer. And we don't often ask the question, could we be optimizing for someone who doesn't already have that tribal knowledge? Now, back to this notion of the economy for a moment. What are the things that we're buying and selling in this economy of keystrokes that I've come up with? Well, I would suggest that we're buying and selling ideas. We are buying and selling ideas that we have expressed in our code. And to illustrate that, let me give you two assertions that I have found to be very true. The first assertion is that it can be proven through computer science that there are an infinite number of programs that can be written within the space of correct solutions to a particular problem. There's an infinite number of programs to do it. That's interesting, infinite. That's a big number. How do we pick from an infinite space of programs? How do we pick what's the right program for us to write? A second observation that I would make is that especially on these higher level languages like with JavaScript, the code that we write is not as directly connected to the code that runs as we might like to feel. And this is uncomfortable for me, honestly, because I'm a craftsman. I like to know I choose to write my for loop in a very specific way. And it's uncomfortable, but it's a fact that I have to admit that when my code shows up to the JavaScript engine with this carefully constructed for loop, the JavaScript engine will say, okay, I see what you're getting at. You're trying to repeat this a certain number of times. I'm not going to use a for loop at all. I'm going to do it in an entirely different way. And what happens is we find out that our code is merely just a suggestion to the computer of what it ought to have as an outcome. It's not going to take our code necessarily as a direct prescription. You must do it exactly this way in exactly this order. The good news is that the computer is usually much better at figuring that stuff out than we are. It comes up with a much more efficient way, and I'm happy about that. But I do have to separate out that when I'm worrying about like I++ or ++I or other kind of nuanced details like that, and it turns out it doesn't matter because the JavaScript engine's going to figure it out from my suggestion. It's going to figure out what to do anyway. So if there's an infinite number of programs that can be written, and if whatever program we choose to write is just a suggestion, then what is the purpose of code? And this is not a unique idea to me, but I will suggest to you that the purpose of code is not first and foremost to instruct the computer, it is to communicate. It is that code is first and foremost a means of communication with other human beings, other members of our developer team, and maybe most importantly, our future selves. We are communicating with other humans with how we write our code. Not to say that the control of the computer is completely unimportant, but it's a far distant second to the communication. And this has been a transformative change to my way of thinking from earlier in my career when I was just down in the trenches, just trying to churn through because I needed to get the next promotion and get this, and I'd grab a plugin off of Stack Overflow and put it in, and then it worked. And it's been a change, a deep, profound change in my perspective to think it doesn't matter so much one choice or another to the computer, but it matters a whole lot, one choice or another to another human being. Now, I'm going to take a risk here and invoke a person that probably most people in the room aren't super in love with. You probably know him, creator of Linux. And I'm going to use a quote from him, and I don't want that to suggest that I'm endorsing the overall message that he has, because quite frankly, he's a giant asshole. But mixed in with all of that other stuff, there are sometimes a little bit of wisdom. And I want to show you a quote from Mr. Torvalds. The code could easily have been done with just a single and understandable conditional, and the compiler would actually have generated better code, and the code would look better and more understandable. This was a rant in response to some commit that somebody had tried to put into the Linux code branch, and they had done something in some particular way, and it just completely offended his very nature as a human being. He had to attack this person. But mixed in with all of that other crap, which was completely ridiculous and unacceptable, was this little nugget of wisdom. Because there is something of some truth here. It is true that we can actually create easily understandable code. Code that looks better, not just because it has fewer characters, but because it's more understandable, more recognizable to people. It is possible to do. I know we don't often approach it that way. And he goes on to say, I want to make it clear to everybody that code like this is completely unacceptable. He's talking about code that is hard to understand. It might be clever, it might take a shortcut, but it is hard to understand. It is hard to understand for a person who is not already immersed in the tribal knowledge of that particular developer's cleverness. And he said, I want to make it clear that this is completely unacceptable. And if there's lots of things that I disagree with him on, I completely agree with him on this. It is unacceptable for us to continue to optimize for our creation of code and completely ignore the consumption of code, because code is a means of communication. It's a very important means of communication. It is the very lifeblood by which all learning will happen throughout this industry. And if we cannot effectively communicate through our code, we cannot teach, and if we cannot teach, our industry will die. We have to be able to teach. We have to be able to learn. And I think it's important the kind of code that we choose to do that with. Now I'm going to invoke another quote often used. Martin Fowler says, any fool can write code that a computer can understand, but good programmers write code that humans can understand. And again, I know it's often quoted, but I think there are nuggets of very important wisdom there. And that I've taken as a personal challenge to myself. Not just can I get the job done, can I get the code to work? And believe me, I understand if you're feeling like that some days that's all you can do, because I'm there most of the time. I'm like barely just getting the code to actually function correctly. But when I have an opportunity to try to refactor, to try to improve, this quote is right at the very top of my consciousness. Trying to figure out how to rearrange that code so that it more effectively communicates to my future self, because 3 days from now, the code that I literally wrote today, I will not understand. Promise you. It happens all the time. I will go back to that code and what was I thinking? And I literally can't tell because I'm just so bad at communicating with code. So this is what obsesses me, is how can I improve the communication of my code? Now, in the HTML world, there's a principle called the principle of constituencies. And the principle of constituencies basically says, wherever possible, the user's concerns are more important than the author's concerns, which are more important, and it goes on to list several different entities that we work with, like specification developers and browser developers. But you'll notice at the very forefront of the list is that it puts the user as the most important constituency. Unfortunately, we've seen an awful lot of development in the web platform that I think has switched these two, to where the author of code gets more attention than the user, the end user of that. But the principle of constituencies is really important. It's a guiding principle for how we're supposed to be developing stuff. So if that works for the web platform, let me be so bold to try to rewrite that for us as developers and suggest to you that there's a principle of constituencies involved, which suggests that the reader is more important than the writer. The reader of your code, their concern is much more important. They are a more important constituency than you, the author of that code. And I think sometimes, in fact, most of the time, we have this backwards. We think that to be effective developers, we have to be really, really good at writing code as fast and efficiently as possible, and that's what's going to serve the overall good. As if we're the only ones that will ever need to read our own code. And that's just flat out not true. So back to this notion of keystrokes. The keystrokes that we're spending ought to be spent with the reader in mind, not with the writer in mind. Now, I'm not hating on any particular feature. I'm going to talk about a couple of quick examples. But I'm not trying to hate on any particular feature or even a framework or a pattern or an idiom. But I want to suggest to you that I think, by and large, the decisions that get made, the statements that get thrown around like, oh, well, this is more readable than that, they really aren't actually taking into account the reader. They're more taking into account the writer. And one of the reasons why that happens, I think, is that we seem to be very drunk on this notion of convenience. We are constantly developing new and more sophisticated tool chains to take more and more of the stuff that we used to do as our daily job and automate it away so that we can get back to the important work of thinking about our code. And we are so drunk on this notion of convenience to the extent that we will sacrifice the real, true, non-tribal knowledge readability of our code all too quickly. Now, I think one of the gateways to that is this notion of convention over configuration. And I know it's a hot button issue because I know a lot of people believe very strongly in this idea of convention over configuration, and I will completely agree with you that it absolutely makes the experienced, seasoned developer significantly more effective at their job. There is no question about it. But it also makes the brand new developer who's not seasoned in that particular set of tribal knowledge completely lost. And I have personally had this experience on many, many occasions in my career, walking into a place on the first day and being handed a big, thick book that says, here, read all of this tribal knowledge, and then you'll understand all of the conventions that are used when the file name is this way and it's in exactly this directory, and it just all magically works. We've become very drunk on this idea that convenience, that ease, is the most important thing. There's a really fantastic talk. Some of you may have heard of it before. The most recent title for this talk is Simplicity Matters. An earlier version of the talk was Simple Made Easy. This talk is by Rich Hickey, and I honestly, genuinely, truly believe that this should be required watching, viewing, reading for all developers, not just once, but literally every month for your entire career. And without, at the expense of not repeating his entire talk, let me just give you the simple premise. It's this notion that we go after easiness and we call it simplicity. We think that ease and simplicity are the same, and in fact, they're really not. They're very, very different. Simplicity being the opposite of complexity, complexity being things braided together, tightly bound together. And he suggests this notion in this talk, which if this was a religion, I would be a convert and a disciple to. He suggests this notion that when we go after easiness first, the thing that is quick and easy for us to grab, we oftentimes end up with complexity, incidentally. But if, on the other hand, we go after simplicity first, we have plenty of opportunities to grab at the easiness. But you see, you have to change what you value. If you value how easy and quick it is for you to get up and going and how magical this tool just makes it all work for you, and you don't value the readability, for example, then you will reach for easiness and you will end up with that incidental complexity. So I think that's one of the ways that we get ourselves into this problem. I want to give a couple of quick examples because I know I've been very abstract, but I want to try to give a couple of very simple, concrete examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. In JavaScript, for example, this expression, x plus y times z. Now, when you write code like that, without any parentheses, you are inviting your reader to participate in a set of tribal knowledge called operator precedence. If they're aware of operator precedence, then they know that the multiplication will happen first before the addition. But if they are not aware of it, they might be tempted to think, well, I've heard that stuff goes left to right. So maybe it'll do x plus y, and then it'll multiply by z. And we, as the developers that are clever, say, well, I saved myself a couple of keystrokes and just took advantage of operator precedence because I chose to learn it. And I would suggest that these two keystrokes are really important. Now, those parentheses are not needed by the computer. The compiler would probably laugh at your code. It chuckles to itself like, what a waste putting those parentheses there. But our code's not for the computer. Our code is for the person that reads our code and doesn't already have that pre-tribal knowledge. Another example, this is extremely common. I do this all the time in my code. The default value idiom, using the OR operator, and we're saying if x is not already set, then set it to the default value of 42. Super clever, right? But I can tell you from firsthand experience teaching brand new developers that they struggle to understand what on earth that is all about. And it takes an awful lot of teaching. And in fact, developers from other languages where the OR and AND operators don't operate this way. They actually operate returning Boolean values. They're like, wait, how could 42 come out as a result of that? It's different and weird to them. But we as JavaScript developers, we think, oh, I'm clever. I'll use what I know of the language to my advantage so that I can save a few keystrokes. Lastly, the ternary operator versus something like an if-else statement. Now, the ternary operator in and of itself, I use it on a regular basis. I'm not saying that it is a bad operator, but let me tell you one example where ternary really goes off the rails is when you start chaining them together. And you're chuckling and laughing because all of you have seen code like this, and a few of you have committed the sin of doing it. And so you invited the reader of your code into a special set of tribal knowledge, not just operator precedence, but another special set of tribal knowledge called associativity. And for those of you that understand what I say when I tell you that the ternary is right associative where other operators are generally left associative, well, I just spoke your language and you totally understand what I'm talking about. But the rest of you are like, what? Right associative? That doesn't make any sense. Should we be asking people to go and study for a PhD exam before they can read our code? Or could we spend a few extra keystrokes and make our code more clear? Now, am I saying that we should dumb down the code? Is that what I'm claiming? No, absolutely not. Definitely not. I don't want you to dumb down the code. But you know what I do want? I want you to have a culture in your teams of everybody learning. And I think that one of the best ways to do that is to have code review. Not code review in the style that you've maybe heard about or seen where it's an insult to a person, like, oh, let's laugh at how terrible this was, or you feel bad or you feel scared about submitting your code. No, I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking about the kind of code review where a junior developer submits something that works and a senior developer takes the opportunity to say, let me help you learn a little bit. Here's an article about that idiom that you used or that operator that you used, and here's a slightly better way of doing that. So in the future, you have an opportunity to write better code. And then that developer turns around and participates in that process with someone else. Code review is incredibly important, and we should all be striving for a constant, continual learning cycle that we learn to teach and then we teach to learn. It's symbiotic. A brief note about ES6. I know that there are some really loved features of ES6 and a few maybe not so loved features of ES6. Let me just give you one example of a feature. The ... operator. Now, I actually like this operator a lot, but it certainly does a really good job of hiding some magic under the scenes. And if you teach this operator completely out of context, somebody just thinks of it as purely syntactic sugar. They don't understand what it's replacing, that it's replacing the spreading that the apply function does, for example. They don't understand that context, so it doesn't make sense to them why it's being used in that particular context. So I think you can actually teach these things, and we can develop that culture of constantly learning. The biggest narrative that I think you should take away about ES6, the features that are in there, some of them I love and some of them I'm not so much a fan of, but the biggest narrative to take away from ES6 is that it moves us to less of the imperative programming model and more to a declarative programming model. If you're not familiar with the notion of imperative versus declarative, to put it very simply, imperative is telling it how to do something, and declarative is saying, this is what I want to have happen, you figure it out. Now, no program can be an entirely declarative or entirely imperative. That's not healthy. But it would be a good idea to have a good mixture of the two and maybe err on the side of declarative, because declarative forms are easier for people to learn and understand. So I like ES6, but I like ES6 as long as we commit to learning. And that's why I don't teach ES6 totally in isolation. I always teach it in the context of what these forms are improving upon from the prior versions of the language. So what about abstractions? Are abstractions good? Absolutely, abstractions are good. It's just bad when you hide those abstractions. That's really bad. Don't hide those abstractions. Have them right out there in the open. How many of you have heard of Clarke's 3 laws, specifically Clarke's 3rd law, which says, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic? I like to be so bold as to repurpose that quote and say, any sufficiently unlearned technology is indistinguishable from magic. The abstractions are not bad. They make us more effective. But you know what the purpose of an abstraction is? Not to hide stuff. It's to make you better at coding the layer that you were being confused by. So it's to remove confusion and noise so that you are better at coding that particular layer. Good programmers don't try to hide stuff. Good programmers intentionally move things behind abstractions, and they know exactly how that code works. So just don't hide your abstractions. A quick note about code comments, and then I'll begin to wind down. Now, some people say that code needs to be self-documenting, and therefore we don't need code comments, and I think that's complete nonsense. I think code comments are absolutely important. But the problem with code comments is that we're often trying to answer the what question, which is terrible. You should not have a line of code that says I equals I plus 1, and then a comment next to it that says add 1 to I. That's what the code is for. Don't answer the question what. That's not the important question. You know what you should answer? Why? Why am I adding 1? 1 is a magic number. What is the importance of incrementing by 1? And optionally, sometimes we have to answer the question how. Those are the questions that we need to be answering with our code comments. So to try to come back full circle here, code is about communication. Communication can be made more or less effective if we are better or not so good at using our keystrokes wisely. So to sort of leave you with kind of a closing thought on that topic, I would suggest that you should try to make every keystroke and every keystroke saved count for real value. I'm not saying never use a shortened form. I'm not saying always write the longer form. I'm saying think a lot more about this than you currently are. I want you to make code that is more teachable. And I think the path to more teachable code is what's going to make us rich in the economy of keystrokes. Thanks very much for listening. I appreciate everybody's attention. I know it's been a long day. Oh, I ran out of characters again. But I appreciate it very much. Thanks to the organizers of this fantastic conference.